Okay, everybody, I'm going to get started. The rest will trickle in as they do. My name is Don Bowman. My company is Agilicus, and we make industrial remote access for critical infrastructure. And today's topic is about specifically around wastewater industry. And we're going to talk about some of the alerts and best practices and things that are coming in, and how to put some of those into a more concrete term. So first thing I'll do is I'll talk about some of the risks that have materialized of late. The most exciting one is this week was Arkansas City, Kansas. They had to shut down their freshwater plant due to cybersecurity attack. But there's been a bunch that have come up recently. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what I call the avalanche of advice. Every day there's a notice from CISA or the DOJ or the FBI or CSEC or whatever set of acronyms saying, be better people instantly. Here's 19 best practices to do, and you have to have it done by 3 p.m. today. Thanks. I'm going to talk a little bit about some evergreen tactics, things that you can apply that are really independent of the attack vectors. These are just sort of best practices, sort of like washing your hands before you eat kind of thing, that are relatively economic to do and have good return on investment. And selfishly, they relate to our product offering. And I'm going to talk about where some of the biggest risks and rewards come from and some alternative security models that don't have some of the risks above. But today is mostly about interpreting that avalanche of advice. So, we all have Google inboxes and things and feeds and YouTubes and stuff. And there's no lack of, oh my God, that bad thing happened to that person just now. And one of the most interesting ones was the one in Muleshoe, Texas, where that water tank overflowed, and they actually posted the video of them, hacking the HMI. We've put it on our website if you want to see it. And it seems very scary, particularly to the average person. You get this very old school industrial interface, and there's this sort of level and water tank schematic and picture, and then somebody's speaking over it in Russian. And it's obvious the person using it doesn't really know what they're doing, but it's also obvious that the HMI was available to somebody without login using VNC. VNC is not a weak protocol. It just needs a proper identity-aware proxy in front of it, which is what we do. So there's nothing really wrong with having that HMI available to the operator remotely, but in this case, it was a very guessable password. We saw that hit in Pennsylvania, where we had the Iran-Israel conflict that flew over into a little bit of a PLC HMI issue. And of course, Florida with the Ultramar water treatment plant. And then you're seeing all these bulletins that say Rockwell Automation encourages customers. Well, Rockwell Automation makes an awful lot of product with an awful lot of age in them. And these are often not very specific. Anything that uses Ethernet IP or CIP, well, that's everything they've made in 30 years. So digging in and finding out, do I have that CVE? My inventory is not super detailed. How would I know? These risks have materialized. These are things that have happened. Good people have had bad things happen to them, and there's more. And it's kind of like an iceberg. For every one you see, there's probably 5 that didn't get reported publicly, or maybe they didn't even know. That's one of our challenges when you're talking about what they call an advanced persistent threat or a nation state. They're not like a cyber criminal, which is trying to immediately cause damage to get a ransom. The nation state is trying, let me get in there and stay in there forever in case I need it someday. And that means that some people may have a vulnerability that is exploited and exploitable and not know it. So the genesis of this webinar, I did some blog posts on some of these, and a little bit later in the webinar, Drew will post some in here, but you see these very glossy looking TLP clear documents. TLP is traffic light protocol, and it indicates who you can share it with. And it's got a bunch of very prestigious logos at the top. You've got MSISAC, and you've got the Canadian Security, et cetera. And you've got DOJ and CISA and FBI and USDA, and you got the UK and, US Food and Drug Association. There's a lot of logos on that. And the weight of those logos sits heavily on the shoulders of people that are just trying to get the best thing done. But what do you do? Like, how can I defend myself against Russia? Well, that's a very asymmetric conflict. So that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today, is some best practices in that asymmetric conflict and how to interpret these documents. The other one that I found interesting, the top cybersecurity actions for securing water systems. In May of this year, the U.S. issued NSM 22 National Security Memoranda, and it formalizes which agency has oversight for cybersecurity of each of the critical infrastructure silos. And it formalizes, for I believe the first time, that the EPA owns it for water treatment, not CISA, not DOJ, and not FBI, and so on. So there will be probably, we think that some of these guidelines and best practices are going to switch into regulations and obligations at some time in the future. And there's some battles over that about you can't force me to do something I can't afford, and there's some government and court issues, but that's what we think is going to happen. And you see these scary things like remove all VPNs from network immediately. CISA themselves was hacked. So CISA used the Avanti product internally, and they were hacked. MITRE was hacked as well. And so they're probably a little bit embarrassed about that. But these VPNs have very broad onward reach. So they're effectively a long Ethernet cable, and you've got all your risk and trust in a single basket. And if it breaks, it has a broad thing. So that's why they have these, you must update it by noon today. And some of them were not updatable. The rootkit has managed to modify the BIOS. So even doing a regular update, it wouldn't get rid of the malware. You'd have to find a way to reprogram the flash in it or return to manufacturer. So the TLDR of these material risk is all VPNs have been breached this year. So the big ones, Cisco AnyConnect, Avanti, Palo Alto, Fortinet, they've each had one or more flaws that have been exploited. They're added to what's called the no one exploited vulnerability. That's the KEVs. So the KEVs, they move from the abstract, a bad thing exists, to the concrete. A bad thing exists that bad people are using against people like you. So on that KEV list, that's the ones that you need to have mitigating measures in place for. And the most obvious mitigating measure for a VPN is to discontinue its use. I don't believe there's a need for it. I believe that it has a purpose in site to site and things of that nature, but zero trust, we're talking about strongly identifying a user and then giving them the right access to the right resource, means that when something bad happens, because I believe in defense in depth, the idea is that something bad will happen as opposed to let's put all our effort into preventing it. The example I use there, it's the human body. So my skin is my firewall. And that's what keeps bacteria from killing me. But the reason I don't die when my cat playfully bites me is I have a second layer, which is I have white blood cells. That's a concept called defense in depth. So here, what we're thinking is you're going to need to have, blast radius containment. Zero trust gives you a great blast radius containment. That user did something bad, and therefore that resource is at risk, is a better statement than, I don't know what happened, but probably everything. We're seeing that, this is not going to go away. All of the industrial vendors have severe and systemic security issues. They're not going to get better, and you're not going to patch. So what's going to happen is you're going to continue to run a PLC that's 15 years old because it does the job and it's hard to reprogram. And it's not going to get a new operating system because it doesn't really have an operating system. It doesn't have Patch Tuesday. It doesn't have Microsoft Windows Update. And the protocols that it runs, Modbus and CIP and so on, they have no security. There's no encryption. There's nothing in it. It isn't going to go away. So all of the stuff from the information technology side of the universe, those best practices about patching everything and refreshing it every 3 years, it isn't going to suddenly start to apply in a wastewater treatment plant. It would be great if it did, but the odds are very against it based on how things are. The air gap concept, a lot of you have architected your plants around a single security layer. The inside is infinitely infinitely untrustable, but there's an air gap, so that's okay. Well, things can get over that air gap. It's kind of porous. One of my customers, we did a security audit for them, and I just sort of dropped a few USB keys, in the parking lot, the reception desk, and so on. And they had a little beacon on them, so when they got plugged in and had internet access, they would call home. And some of them never called home. They might have been plugged in inside the plant, but the plant didn't have internet access. But some of them did call home, which means somebody associated with that plant has used it. Which means if I had malware on it, it's very likely that it could have been in there. Spear phishing is another one. People are moving their laptops back and forth. You've got vendors that are making mistakes and publishing bad things. But you also have things that are purposely allowed in and out of the air gap, like a license manager or remote support. And these are materializing this risk. But the other thing is, In the past, our biggest defense is that industrial control, particularly water treatment, was the most boring discipline in the world. You got no money, so why are the criminals aren't coming around to shake you down for a couple of bags of chlorine in the back? But they are exciting to nation state opponents. So make no mistake, Russia, North Korea would be very happy to see a lot of embarrassment in the Western world from, wastewater treatment plant backing up or something of that nature. And it's exciting to them. They're willing to put effort into it. So suddenly we're a target. And the security model of that infrastructure, coming back to this government guidance. So it's the government guidance, it's sort of, there's two avenues. The first is they say these sort of noble but unachievable objectives. Be perfect people by tomorrow and change everything. But then on the other hand, they kind of understand things are going to be the way they are. Even with infinite money, there's certain things you couldn't achieve. You're not, what are you going to do? Start your own PLC company and invent your own internetworking protocols for it and make them secure from scratch? You might. That's what IIoT 4.0 is all about, making everything MTLS and MQTT and this and that. But when the rubber hits the road, you got an entire industry to uplift there. You got all the RTUs, and a lot of them are telnet based, and you got vendors that have gone out of business, but the equipment lives on. So the security model of this infrastructure is very much based around a pre-internet, pre-nation state attack world. And the original security model was physical, badges and doors. And then we started to put simple networking in there, and it became this air gap concept. But now there's so much specialization there. So first of all, environmental restrictions and efficiency and other things are driving us to be better and better and better. So the process control is tighter and tighter and tighter, which means there's more and more sensors, there's more stuff to report, which means we're starting to use cloud for the reporting technologies. Vendors are starting to experiment with SaaS business models because they can't afford to sell it, to build it and sell it. They have to have an ongoing revenue. And as a consequence, there's licensing. And, it used to be one person would come with a screwdriver and commission a plant. And now you need an expert in each of the domains, an HMI expert and this and that. And, it's biting into the air gap. And the air gap is starting to become more of that Swiss cheese on the right there than it is a castle, moat, and wall. And the other thing is that we found is a lot of backdoors that lurk in here. So people put this air gap in, and then one of the teams, without really thinking it through, has a pragmatic need, and they just slap in a cellular modem on something and it sort of hides, or TeamViewer, and then later you end up in the news. That's what happened at the Oldsmar water plant. I don't think anybody expected that TeamViewer system to become national news, but it did. You think about the different motivations of these actors. So, going back to the government guidance, you operate the plant, you own the risk, you care about security at any cost, you have a very high downside. But you have a set of partners, and they have slightly different view on the world. They don't want things to be insecure, but they manage multiple plants. So that could be your vendors, it could be a system integrator you work with, it could be remote operations. And what they want is simplicity. And they don't really have the downsides. This is what we call a moral hazard. You own the downside, I own the upside. 2008 financial crisis. So here, if you ask somebody that's big and supports a lot of water plants like Tetra Tech or Veolia or something, they can't have 500 different VPNs installed on their individual tech's laptops for each of their different customers. They just want one way to do everything. And they're going to push you to the lowest common denominator, which is going to be, give me a single shared user and password. I'll give it to all my users and no multi-factor. We're not doing that nonsense here. We're going to support you properly. And actually, you start to listen to them. Well, they know what they're doing. And as a consequence, your interests become slightly unaligned. You own all the downside, and they influence you to increase your risk. It causes bad behavior. I think there's a way to align these risks, align this interest. So let's break down some of these scary threats. So, those PDFs that are up there, Drew's going to paste one of the links in here, but all resources need single sign-on with no shared local accounts. So on the first thing, nobody would disagree with that. It seems like a good idea to me, Second is, well, that's going to be impossible. The things inside the plant, I can't have single sign-on because I need internet, and I got these guys that don't really work for me. They're not on the domain, and how would I do that? And this device here, the manufacturer, it's got a hard-coded account in it because of how it works. And, it's just got a thing. Can't do it. And the second is all resources need multi-factor authentication. Same thing. Oh my God, I'm air-gapped. I'm not on the internet, and we're not going to buy YubiKeys for everybody. Here's what we're going to do. we're going to take these top two and we're going to start with the HMI, right? The human machine interface. Which thing interacts with the human more than anything else in the equation? The human machine interface. And we're going to put in an identity aware proxy that makes it look like a web page to them. So they open their mobile phone, they open their tablet, whether they're at the plant or at home or wherever, and it uses a web-centric login flow. Why do we want single sign-on instead of shared or local accounts? Well, there's a bunch of reasons. The first one is phishing. If you teach your team that there's lots of different ways to sign into stuff, they're going to fall for phishing every time. An email comes that says, blah, 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 we've changed the password system on the HMI, can you log in to confirm? All the systems look different, they're not going to know. If you teach your team that everything you sign into looks exactly like your email experience with Office 365, and if you see anything different, they're going to start to see the little green icon on the upper left. They're going to start to see it's HTTPS. They're going to start to look at the domain name. You want it to be consistent to bring the human into the equation for spear phishing protection. The second one is staff churn. We all like to think that we have infinitely trustworthy coworkers and we'll work with them for life. The reality is we work with a number of different companies, and those companies each have individual churn within their teams, and you don't necessarily become aware of that. And one of your partners might have a person that has a personal issue, a gambling issue or something like that, and they could become compromised or they could leave on bad terms. And that shared account means that password is never changed. Multiple people have it. It's not safe. The number of people you share your password with should be approximately the same that you share your toothbrush with, which is nobody. And you don't want local accounts. Local accounts are even worse because they're by definition shared, but also, the machine might be, might have a flash card you could read, or maybe it's the same for across all vendors. And you see some of them like that, where you see like a mobile hotspot device and it's got a well-known password in it or something like that. So if we start with and multi-factor, multi-factor is any two or more of something I am, I have, I know. So I have my phone, I am me, I know my password. The reason that you need at least two of those is those risks are uncorrelated. My password might be idiotically the name of my cat and in a breach online, but you still would have to come and steal my phone. So the chances of somebody pickpocketing me and getting that breach, they're uncorrelated. So something I have, I am, I know. Any two or more of those is multi-factor. And it doesn't need to be complicated. A lot of people think, multi-factor is going to be this code generator. I'm going to have to log in every time and I'm going to do this. And, people won't like it. It doesn't have to be like that. It can be a simple push notification and you look in your phone, biometrics and thing and that and passkey, and technology's gotten better. Putting that on HMI seems like a daunting task. Well, Don, you idiot. This HMI I bought from Rockwell in 1978 and it runs VNC and Windows CE 6.0 and it's never going to change in its lifetime. It doesn't even have usernames, let alone passwords. I know. Identity aware proxy sits in front of it. We put all the strong stuff on the user side and we keep the weak stuff on one link there. And that's what Zero Trust is all about. The user has a perfectly simple sign-in experience. Open browser, click HMI, I'm there. That's what your guidance is saying. You're going to see a scary stat in a minute. I'm going to foreshadow it without telling you. And it relates to the United States Coast Guard. And it relates to the number of systems that had a default vendor password in it. I want you to think in your mind what percentage of them it is. And this comes from the Coast Guard themselves. They reported this. The third thing is, all that advice that's up there, it's saying get rid of the VPN. It's saying the VPN becomes effectively an extension of your physical perimeter. And if you have one, then the person that has access to it has access to everything. Yes, there are ways to do segmentation within a VPN, but it's very difficult. There's also no audit trail. Once you're connected, you stay connected. Your partners love the VPN. I'll let you in a secret. I used to be a vendor, and we're a big telecom vendor. And my telecom customer is very similar to wastewater plants in some regards. And there was this don't ask, don't tell. Everybody wanted to get mean time to repair in the right direction and just get along. So what my support team would do is they had a virtual machine that was always running, that was always VPN'd into every customer site. And then the support team would just remote desktop to it, and they were just all signed in with no passwords, right? I bet you the compliance of that was sketchy. So disable the VPN. It's not that hard to do. Rip the Band-Aid off. We got you covered. Discontinue those jump boxes. So the reason that people don't like TeamViewer and so on is they create an external password system that's internally there. And Zero Trust can get rid of that with that single sign-on. That universal fine-grained audit, this is another thing, they're talking about understanding what you have, but also having telemetry when something bad happens to know what your blast radius was. And then segmenting the network. Zero Trust is a model that does that, but try not to have it all or nothing. Defense in depth is about segmentation. If you can keep your historian segmented from the rest, you might be a little bit happier. If you can keep the RTUs all segmented from the rest, you might be a little bit happier. Security cameras on the site. There's a lot of stuff that sits around the plant, but isn't really part of the process. And that might be door lock, access control, security cameras. One of the customers I went to, they had cameras in the process areas because it was allowed, and they wanted to be able to look and see if bad stuff was happening or if the fires had gotten out of the boxes or whatever, but they didn't want to go in there. So these security cameras on there, I'm like, these security cameras, they get the default username and password, they get a ton of vulnerabilities, but they're also trying to make a connection back home to China. This is really what you want. Your firewall's blocking it right now. All it takes is one guy to misconfigure the firewall, and who knows where that goes. There's a reason Hikvision was discontinued. So if I expand on those asks, there's a very specific document here. Drew's going to link it in a second, but they give you 8 things to do. All right, and the 8 things are broken down into sort of bite-sized chunks, and I thought I would talk a little bit about them today. Reduce exposure to public-facing internet, VPN, a lot of HMIs and port forward. One of my favorite tools is called Shodan, SHODAN.io. Open that up, it's a web page, and just type in Rockwell. And then pick your jaw up off the floor when you realize there's a bunch of people out there that have a PLC on the public internet. And in another webinar I've done, I've showed how you could attack that. So I showed a Python script. We were able to read the program out of it. Some of them don't have the key in the run program switch properly. And some of them are little things like car washes or gas stations. But what were they thinking? So you need to reduce the exposure to the public-facing internet. It should be nil. Systems like ours are outbound only. There's no inbound connectivity except for authenticated users. The second is conducting a regular cybersecurity assessment. This is a big ask for a water treatment plant because there's not really a big body of knowledge. It's easy to go hire somebody to come in and look at your Microsoft SQL Server and your Active Directory and your Exchange. It's much harder to have somebody come in and do an assessment of this process stuff. The process stuff's in a bunch of rusty pedestals that nobody really knows what's in because the schematic doesn't match. But secondly, there really hasn't been a lot of research around the vulnerabilities in this. There's some. So they look for best practices like have you changed your passwords on things? And that's going to include printers and it's going to include your backup systems and other stuff. And they're saying change your default passwords immediately. There's no reason. You bought a box. It came from the vendor. Step 1, plug it in. Step 2, change the default password. Change it to something you don't know if you can get away with that, but certainly change it. Because otherwise, I just got to Google it. Going back to my water treatment plant with those cameras in the process area, I didn't have to spend a lot of time. It's not like they show on TV where I'm a hacker, I'm sweating away and trying to figure out this password. Oh my God, is Des 56, Shaw does. No. I just Google it. And it's like username admin, password admin. Oh, I didn't even need to Google that. Boom. Conduct an inventory. Inventory is a tough one. It's not super hard. We've done it with some clients. There's other tools out there that do it. You just need to know what you got. And it's better to know in advance than when something bad's happened. Because that way, when one of these guidance comes out and says, if you have the blah, blah, blah version, blah, 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 you can answer, do I or don't I have that? If I do, I should start panicking. If I don't, I can start laughing at my neighbors. It's called Schadenfreude. Develop and exercise a plan. Well, you're starting getting into Cybersecurity Framework 2.0 here. What's your response going to be? A lot of water treatment plants, they've got a manual, right? So it's not like if the process stops with SCADA that everything breaks. So they kind of know what they're going to do. But there's a little bit of concern. There's some devices in there that could become physically damaged. We saw that happen in Iran with Stuxnet, where the United States and Israel got together and they created a worm and they sent it in and the centrifuges went at a very specific speed. They introduced some eccentricity to the orbit. They wore out all the bearings and crashed it all and so on. So they're a little bit worried about stuff like that where there is no safety PLC or there's no stop limit switch but that's what you've got to have. What's my plan? Step 1, unplug the internet cable. Step 2, put all the PLCs in run mode, not in program mode, things of that nature. You need backups, and you need the backups to be offsite, and they need to be about operational technology as well. There's no real excuse here. If something goes wrong, do you want to reverse engineer your PLC firmware from the plans that the original system integrator put together? Because they didn't keep it. So where is it? You've updated that a couple times a year since, because some bearing is wearing out and then some VFD need to be changed parameters. And you don't want to have to re-engineer how everything was set up. And that includes configuration, like what IP addresses are where, etc. And just back it up somewhere and make that somewhere be not in the same physical building. The other problem with wastewater is it's actually below the floodplain because gravity. You want things from people's houses to flow down towards it on the way to the creek or whatever. So as a consequence, when you get a really heavy rain, do you want your backup sitting on the floor in that plant? Because that's where water's going to back up first. You need it somewhere else off-site. And that goes back to that air gap. But, oh my God, the air gap doesn't allow outbound. There's ways to solve that. We'll solve it for you. Reduce your exposure to vulnerabilities. This one is a bit nebulous. There's this concept called a CVE, Common Vulnerability and Exposure, and you can go search it for your devices and you get this big, long, scary list. Hundreds and hundreds or thousands and thousands. And they'll talk about severity 9 and 8 and 7. But really, the best way to reduce this is to try to stay modern, try to keep stuff the same, try to keep it updated. But more importantly, you're going to be putting in mitigating measures. So yes, I have that vulnerability, but it's not going to have a big an impact to me because I have zero trust in front. I have network segmentation in front. I have a backup of the system. And they want you to do some training with your team. Number one training you can do is going to be phishing. Get the human involved. Just get them a little bit suspicious. A lot of your operators are a little bit suspicious tinfoil hat people to start with. Let's face facts. Just tell them the Russians are coming for them, and they'll start to look. They're coming for you, and they do it with emails that have links to make you go to websites without a green icon on them. Okay, let's get them. I'm going to let you in a secret. First, I tell this as a joke. 2 hikers are out hiking. They come upon a bear. The first guy bends over to make sure his 2 shoes are tied tight. Second guy says, "What are you doing? You can't outrun a bear." He says, "No, I just need to outrun you." I'm going to let you in on a secret. You actually don't need to be better or smarter than the attackers. You just need to be better or smarter than your neighbors. The attacker's going to go where the low-hanging fruit is. And this is a very sad situation and very dysfunctional, but it's also true, right? So imagine that you are the worst for cybersecurity in your state. You don't want to be there. It might be easier to be the best in your state than it is to be better than, a nation-state attacker, which might be nearly impossible. We've talked a lot about zero trust through this. I'm just about to wrap up here with some very other concrete actions, but zero trust is a principle. It's not a singular product, it's a concept. And a lot of people make it out to be the most complicated thing in the world because they're trying to sell it to you. Well, I'm also trying to sell it to you, but I'm going to try to simplify it as a strategy. It's just 3 things. If you got those 3 things, you got zero trust. The first is what I call the who problem. That's identity. Who is that person? If you can identify that person rather than it's a company, it's the Siemens account. How many people work for Siemens? 400,000. There's no way. Okay, it's Jane. All right, I got Jane's account. So that's identity. You need to know who that person is individually and authenticate them with their proper credentials, whatever company they work for. The second part of it is called authorization. That's the what problem. What are they allowed to do? You own that. So you outsource who to the identity provider of your partners and your corporate IT team, but you own what? Dawn is allowed read-only access to this HMI. Jane is allowed access to this PLC, but only after I grant permission each time. That's what? That's the authorization. And the third is how. How do I get you there? So a person on the internet that I've identified strongly is trying to do something they're allowed to do. Let's get their packets to that thing. If you have who, what, and how solved per person resource pair, you have zero trust. So if the user is saying, let me sign into HMI 9, that is zero trust if they do that as themselves. That's what it is. So there's lots of people who are going to put a lot more words around that and documents and so on, but in a nutshell, that's what we're talking about. And that reduces the blast radius because first of all, nothing gets anywhere unless you know who they are. Nothing gets anywhere unless they're allowed to do something. And you know who down to an individual person. The security of that is so much stronger than a shared account on a VPN was used by someone yesterday. Why do we talk about single sign-on? Single sign-on, this one's controversial. It doesn't need to be. Oh my God, that's an IT thing. Nobody really cares. Just create a new username and password. It's more secure. There's more passwords. It's harder to breach them, right? Wrong. In CISA just released their calendar year 23 risk and vulnerability assessment. They call it RVA. And this is a little piece of information from it. Earlier, I foreshadowed something coming from the US Coast Guard. And the answer was 94.4% of their entities had default passwords in place. Entities being the Coast Guard locations and people that work directly with them. It doesn't mean that 94% of systems did, but 94.4% of the entities had one or more default passwords in place. And why is that a problem? There's a concept called lateral traversal. I get into the weak thing and I use it to walk through the rest of the system. So they came up with this little pie chart, and I'm going to talk about the pie chart in a little bit. But in a nutshell, the big red category at the right is valid credentials. Almost half of all attacks that happened last year occurred with valid credentials. Valid meaning it was a username and password. They didn't breach some system with a Stack Overflow or anything like that. And when you think about these default passwords, think security cameras, printers, non-domain systems, the historian you all have underneath some grotty bench somewhere in your labs. Inbound threat mapping. So if we look at what Zero Trust would have done for these top N categories, 41% were valid accounts. Once you centralize those accounts and have strong user sign-in with no password to the user and multi-factor and GUIP blocking and so on, that category vanishes. That's 41% of them, 41.28%. 26% were spear phishing links. So a real person on my network who was otherwise a trustworthy person got this email suggesting that the Prince of Nigeria or something would be a good thing to click on. And it usually is somewhat targeted. AI is making this a lot easier to do. I can go to your website and scrape a bit of information, slap it into an AI, and it'll generate an email that looks like it came from somebody there. Thanks for attending the company picnic last week. As we discussed, we're updating the password system, yada, 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 for your pay stubs. And we need you to sign into, to be able to continue to get your pay stub. Everybody clicks on it, even though the domain name is external. So you need to train the folks for that. There are technical tools that work on solving this, but the reality is it's about training the users to recognize skunky links and recognizing that if the only way they sign in is that single sign-on, then there's no password to get these systems to get breached into. 6.5% were exploiting a public-facing, and 2.7% were external remote services. So these are things that are a little bit weak themselves and maybe weren't, identity, but otherwise were weak. The mule shoe one, for example, an identity-aware proxy, which is what we supply in front of that, problem gone. And then 9.5% were brute force password cracking. What's the number one way to fix that? Don't have passwords. Then there's nothing to brute force. So it's a huge set of these. You've got more than half are solved by putting in a zero trust system, going back to that earlier guidance. And that's that alternative security model. Instead of people showing up at the gate with a badge, or instead of people showing up at the VPN with a badge and not knowing who they are once they're in, just have strong identity for everybody with multi-factor, and then just handle it there. That aligns that risk. The manager doesn't really complain about this. Yeah, all my team have passwords. All my team have users in my Office 365 or my G Suite. They can do single sign-on. This way, when I fire one of my users, you don't have to know about it. Hey, this is great. That aligns that risk. So that moral hazard we mentioned earlier, they're not trying to push you off the cliff of saying, look, one shared VPN, one shared password, and it's more secure for the operator. It's what we call a positive sum outcome. So zero-sum outcome is like poker. For me to win, you have to lose. There's only so many chips in the middle of the pot. When we talk about a positive sum, it's like, a plumber and an architect and a, carpenter get together and build a house. They each put in $10,000 worth of labor, and the house is worth $500,000 at the end of it. Everybody won because it was net positive value created. When you align that risk, everybody wins. It's simpler for me, and it's more secure for you. Security doesn't have to be a barrier. It can be an enabler. So the high-level user view, I'm not going to do a demo today, but basically, as much as possible, it's all web-based. Some things you can't. Rockwell Studio is going to remain a Windows 32 fat client application. There's a way to make that work without the VPN. Most of our customers are using that today, and they get the one resource they need at the one time they need with their single sign-on, with no software to install on their local side. And that's a real key with those third parties. You don't want them having to install your software. They don't want to install your software. So my last slide, my call to arms, my call to action. First, recognizing that there's a growing underserved thing here. So 30 years ago, that plant didn't have an IP address anywhere in it, and if you wanted to work, you got in your truck. Today, my friends, it's all over the map, and there's some system that only one person in the world knows how to, maybe not one, but a small number of people know how to do. And in order to be more effective and efficient, you need to have them be able to get there online. COVID accelerated that. People started working from home more, but it's just the way the world's working. It's inefficient to use Hertz as a means of, doing customer support. You'd much rather use the phone line. Security is getting more important, and lateral traversal is becoming a bigger problem with that Coast Guard stat. One bad thing, they got in and they used that to sniff the network. They got onto the next thing. It's called pass the hash. Understand that the VPN is not an appropriate solution for all. I'm not saying that it's a bad solution for everybody for everything, but your partners don't want to install it, and it's not a good solution for an industrial plant. Understand that single sign-on multi-factor is important for everyone. It's not just that you need to secure your team and who cares about your partners, because your partners are bringing the risk into you. They're effectively going out there with a bunch of viruses and coming in and sneezing on you. So you want them to be as well protected. No shared accounts, no new emails. You don't want to create contractor at company account. It's terrible. I know it's done. With that, I will take any questions. I'd love to have any comments on the follow-up. Feel free to email me, don@agilicus.com. My team will be reaching out to you afterwards. And I guess with that, thank you very much for your time today. We covered a little bit of detail about how to deal with some of those scary government requests. The 2 links that Drew has pasted in there, which are on our website, they go into greater detail about how to very concrete things that you can do. And if you have any more questions, my team would love to follow up with you on any of the topics we talked about today. With that, thank you very much and have a good day. Bye-bye.